Defending Israel with David Harris on JBS is made possible in part by a generous gift in memory of Eric and Mira J. Spector, the Paul and Lynn Late Family Foundation, To Life, to Love, Barbara and Bob Goodkind, the Patricia Worthen Ullman Foundation,
Hello JBS viewers, I'm David Harris and this is Defending Israel. I'm thrilled to share with you this week's guest. Her name is Simone Rodan-Benzaquen. You may have seen her byline in June when she wrote a very widely distributed, much discussed piece in the Free Press, and we'll come to that in just a moment. In the spirit of full disclosure, I hired Simone for her present job at AJC, and perhaps most importantly, by way of introduction, at a time when we in the pro-Israel and Jewish community have too many checkers players and too few chess players, I want you to hear from a consummate chess player. I'd call her a grandmaster of strategy. Simone, welcome to Defending Israel.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me on.
So Simone, let's begin with the Free Press article. It was on the Muslim Brotherhood. It was based on a confidential report the French government had written that was somehow leaked to Le Figaro. You got a copy, you wrote the piece. What have been the ramifications both of the report itself and of your piece with respect to the Muslim Brotherhood and its penetration of Europe?
So first of all, it was to some extent something that had to be out there here in France. The Muslim Brotherhood has been an issue in France and most of Europe over the past few decades. And so most experts know about it. Most in the civil society feel it. And so now the government had to write something about it because it's become a fundamental and structural problem in French society. What it basically says is that the Muslim Brotherhood has over decades built a network across the French Republic with schools, with a real system that is put in place with the objective really to create separate societies for Muslim people here in France, with the objective to radicalize people. The Muslim Brotherhood has the specificity that it's not violent, it's not jihadist, so the objective is not to commit to terrorism, but to really subvert society and create separate societies, parallel societies, really, with the objective really using the immigrant communities here to fundamentally change the framework and of French society. So now it's out here in the open. It created a huge debate within France. Now that it's open, the French government had to react. So Emmanuel Macron, French president, decided and has recently announced that he will create a set of laws to fight against the phenomenon. And what can I say? It's long due. As to the conversation across the world, and in particular in the United States, I think there is growing awareness of the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamism problem is not just a French problem. It's not just a Western European problem. It's certainly not just a Middle Eastern problem, but it's also now a North American problem. And in order to fight it, there are certain things that need to be done.
Okay, so here in the United States, an organization with which I'm also connected, ISCAP, has been trying to shine the spotlight on the Muslim Brotherhood and its penetration here. So JBS viewers, the key to this story is this is a problem for France, but not only for France, as Simone said. It's a problem for Western Europe, and it's a problem for North America. So, Simone, you invited the question, what should be done?
Actually, let me just before answering there, it's also an issue for the Middle East. Let's not forget that the Muslim Brotherhood is banned in a certain number of Muslim and Middle Eastern countries. Of course, it's where it comes from in Egypt, but also in the UAE and other Middle Eastern countries where it really has tried to subvert society. Now, to go back to your question, what needs to be done? There are a certain number of things that can be done. First and foremost, the issue of foreign financing. In Europe, and this has become very clear in the report itself, much of the influence and the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood was able to grow so substantially is because of the financing from foreign countries, in particular Turkey. Turkey is a Muslim Brotherhood country itself under President Erdogan and has created an infrastructure across the European continent, in France, but also in particular in Germany, where there's a very strong Turkish community, and has used this really to radicalize the local Muslim communities. So one of the problems we've had here is that these organizations have been very present, have been very active, have been training, sending imams across Europe, in France and Germany in particular. And then there is another country which is called Qatar. And Qatar has had a very different approach, which is less religious, but which is not necessarily only the financing of mosques and of institutions, but has had a soft approach, in particular by using media, social media. Everybody knows, of course, of the role of Al Jazeera. And here many French European Muslims watch Al Jazeera with a very radicalizing voice, of course, of Al Jazeera. And then, of course, the use of entertainment. They have bought up football clubs here in France, the very famous Paris Saint-Germain. So, for example, very recently, Paris Saint-Germain won the Champions League, and you would have all over Qatar Airways brand, including with President Macron. When the team won, they all came with Qatar Airways T-shirts and celebrated with the images across the European European continent. So this is, of course, a way for European Muslims to sort of admire Qatar as a brand. And therefore, its ability to influence European Muslims is very strong. It also has a younger brand, a social media brand called AJ+, where you get a very strong sort of woke, far left, Islamist, very, very strong anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, frankly, often anti-Semitic voice, but always very cool, always very edgy. And so in the report, specifically, Qatar is being pointed out as being a problem. Now, one of the problems that we have is you will have the Ministry of Interior very clearly pointing out the role of Qatar, of Turkey, as vehicles in radicalizing young Muslims here on the ground. But at the same time, the foreign ministry will have a very different approach and will have a very different relationship with those countries. So it often lacks, in terms of coherence, a very clear approach. You can't have it both ways. So
Simone, this raises the question that many of us have been asking now for years, if not a couple of decades. Do countries like France have the spine to stand up and face the reality? They always seem to be several years behind the threats that they're encountering. Do they have the spine to stand up and defend core, as they call it in France, Republican, not in the American partisan term, but in the French République term? Do they have the spine and the courage to stand up, or are we going to see again and again a kind of appeasement strategy?
So there is no yes and no answer to this. They have, to some extent, the spine, and I think the report itself shows, and the answer to that report shows that there are certain things that they are willing to do, but I don't think necessarily they go all the way. And that's what I mean with having, on the one hand, the approach with the Ministry of Interior, who's very clearly identifies the problem. And then on the other hand, you have the other arm, which is the Foreign Ministry, which then will have a very different approach with Qatar, for example, and also with Turkey. Let's not forget that Turkey is a member of NATO. So it's unfortunately not a clear yes answer. Yes, there are things that are done. Yes, there are things that will be done, in particular on foreign financing, in particular on, for example, the fact that when you have an organization these days in France, it needs to sign on to a charter of Republican values. If they don't, they can get their bank account frozen. They can get basically deleted from one day to the other, which is a good thing. But on the other hand, you can't not understand that Al Jazeera, that AJ Plus, that all of these instruments that have been built, Diyanet from Turkey, all of these instruments also play a role, and therefore the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and yes, the President himself also needs to have a far more confrontational relationship with those countries on particular that issue.
Which raises the question, particularly on the minds of JBS viewers, the Jews of France, the roughly 500,000 Jews of France. Is there a future for the Jews of France? Just a few days before our recording, there was the annual dinner of the Jewish community addressed by the Prime Minister of France. I've attended many of those dinners. You've attended even more. And there are always the assurances from the French government of the day. France is not France without Jews. We will fight anti-Semitism. What's the mood of the Jewish community in France today? Is there a future?
We have asked this question for a very long time. For a very long time, I used to be rather positive. I used to say that indeed France, there was a future in France. These days, I have to say, I'm a little bit more skeptical. Simply because the problem has become so big and that civil society still has not woken up entirely, that I fear, in particular since October 7th, more and more French Jews simply have asked themselves the question before October 7th, whether they did have a future here. And these days, more and more French Jews answer that give an answer to that question. And the answer, unfortunately, for many of them is no. Now, having said that, I think one of the big problems that France and many other countries have had over the years in approaching anti-Semitism is not understanding, first and foremost, that the problem of anti-Semitism was there, then being in a state of denial of where the anti-Semitism came from. And let's be very clear, in much of Western Europe, it comes from Islamists and from the far left. Of course, the far right is still there and it hasn't disappeared, but it's not posing these days the imminent physical threat that it used to. And then I think the other problem, and that's sort of the stage 3 we are now in, is not understanding that the anti-Semitism is just the symptom. That unless we deal with the underlying issues, and that brings us back to the Muslim Brotherhood, that unless we deal with the underlying issues, the anti-Semitism will not disappear. And therefore, that the anti-Semitism is really not the problem of the Jewish community, because at the end of the day, the big change between these days and the 30s is that Jews have somewhere to go. But ultimately, if the problem of anti-Semitism is not solved, it will metastasize, and it already is metastasizing to such an extent that liberal society will be affected, that France will be affected, and France has nowhere else to go. And so I think one of the big problems is that these days is that we absolutely need to deal with the underlying issues, the underlying reasons of why there is anti-Semitism. The polarization of our political spectrum, the fact that the center is falling apart, the problem of radicalization within the Muslim communities on the European and frankly amongst the Western Hemisphere, the problem of ideology, the inability of having any form of dialogue, any form of compromise these days, also because of the algorithms that are pushing radicalization in our societies. So the problems are, of course, very, very deep-seated, and many politicians have a tendency to only want to deal with the symptoms or the small aspects of this and that issue. But what is really needed is an all-society approach in dealing with this very profound crisis of our liberal democracies.
So you've diagnosed the problem. Do you expect that there will emerge this across-the-board society that will respond? Or are we fated to spend the next number of years debating with ourselves what is and is not anti-Semitism and fragmenting the political scene? And in the meantime, once again, the Jews are trapped in the middle.
I think sometimes I have the impression that I'm playing the role of Sisyphus.
I thought of Cassandra.
Cassandra.
Take your pick of Sisyphus or Cassandra or both, because you're playing both roles.
We're playing both roles. You move a step. You go a step forward, 2 steps backwards. A step forward, 2 steps backward. You see things that others don't. You shout. You try and alert the rest of society. People don't want to hear it. I don't have a clear answer for you, to be very honest. I think there are things that are positive, and I don't want to only focus on the negative. When I compare the situation today, here in France in particular, I can see that there are positive things. One of them is that there are more people who have come to understand everything what I just mentioned. There are voices, non-Jewish voices, even Muslim voices, who are taking very strong, frankly, personal, physical risks, and are allies both to Jews, but frankly, to themselves, to their own society. There are people like Caroline Forrest, like Sophia Aram, like in the United Kingdom, Douglas Murray, who has been on your program. There are very, very strong voices out there that, if I'm honest, when I look back 20 years ago, did not exist. The question is if those voices are sufficiently listened to, heard, and frankly, fast enough or faster than our enemies, because unfortunately, what I fear is that the backlash will be very strong. The other thing is, I think there is a strong silent majority. All of the opinion polls in much of Western Europe show it, that people, for example, the opinion on Israel, for example, is far better than what most people think. For example, I give you an example. A majority of French people don't want, for example, to recognize a Palestinian state now without any preconditions. If you had asked any person on the street, most people would have probably told you the opposite. The same goes when you ask people about, do they understand do they believe that anti-Semitism is a problem for Jews or only for the rest of society? A large majority, nearly 80% of them, say that anti-Semitism is a problem for society as a large. Now, the question is, how do you how do you mobilize those people? How do you make sure that they are not just bystanders, that they're not just the silent majority? And I think this is really where the problem is our inability and the inability of politicians to mobilize those elements in society that exist. And the problem is that the only ones who are responding to them are often the far-right populists who address those issues.
In fact, I wanted to ask you, because you have the far right, which used to be defined by Jean-Marie Le Pen, who was clearly a Holocaust denier. He actually had been convicted in that respect.
Yes.
But then he passed away. His daughter leads the party, and she's trying to change the image of the party and actually create an appeal to Jews. On the far left, you have Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who also has a certain popularity, but who is viciously anti-Zionist and anti-Israel, as I understand. So are Jews going to be tempted to move further to the right in response to the situation, or are they still anchored very much in the center-left?
So most Jews, I would say, are still anchored in the center-right, I would say. But there's definitely a temptation, just as for the rest of French society. Jews are French just like everybody else. And so there is definitely a temptation to move to the far right, whether it's Marine Le Pen or Jordan Bardella, who is now the leader of the party, or Eric Zemmour, Sarah Knafo, all sort of these far-right populist leaders who have basically tried to explain to the French public that not only are they not anti-Semitic, not only are they not Israel, but that they are actually the best defenders of Israel and of Jews in France. And so there's definitely a temptation, again, for Jews and non-Jews alike to go down that path. But one of the reasons why that's the case is because the rest of the political class has still not understood that this is what French people want, and not just Jews. That the silent majority wants to deal with the issue of anti-Semitism, that the silent majority wants to deal with the issue of Islamism, that the silent majority wants to deal with the issue of immigration, integration, and identity. I know this is a subject that is so dear to your heart. And that one of the reasons why the far right is blossoming is because there has been a vacuum that has been created by those centrist parties who have not taken up the issues people care about. And it's not something that we're seeing in France, it's what we're seeing across the world, across the liberal democracies, is that the politicians who have a responsibility often shy away from the most difficult topics and leave the space to those who give very simplistic answers.
Simone, I wish we had lots more time. We have just a few minutes, and I need to ask you one other big question, which you and I have discussed elsewhere. You've been saying for years to America, watch Europe closely, because what we see here is crossing the ocean to you. What's your message to America? It's a country you watch closely, you understand well. What are we doing right here? What are we doing wrong here? And you've also had some thoughts on the New York mayor's race, because in a way it's all crystallized around this recent primary. Last thoughts. Everything
I am seeing in the United States, we have seen here in Europe. Everything. Whether it's the radicalization of the political spectrum, whether it's the anti-Zionist anti-Semitism, whether it's DEI, wokeism, and the radicalization in particular of the left, the response then given by the right, the falling apart from the center, all of this we've seen. And yes, I'm also seeing, unfortunately, something that we first saw in the United Kingdom, with Jeremy Corbyn, a danger of a Corbynization, let me put it that way, of the Labour Party, something that we've seen here in France as well during the last elections, where the Socialist Party, which is here the governing party of François Hollande, of Manuel Valls, decided to make an alliance with Jean-Luc Mélenchon because they thought they would win the election and therefore accept the idea that anti-Semitism was not a red line. The same kind of thing I fear I'm starting to see in the United States, where elements within the Democratic Party seem to consider that anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, anti-Israelism are not red lines for the party itself. And that there is a risk that the party itself drifts away from what it's supposed to be or what it always was, meaning a centrist, reasonable, pro-Israel, pro-Jewish party. It destroyed the Labour Party. The Labour Party lost the elections, and only later was it then taken up again by a more reasonable and now the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. But there is a real danger there, and which doesn't only has implications for the party itself, but it has implications for obviously Jews who can lose their political home, but it also has implications for the rest of the democratic space, because if that happens, then where is the Republican Party going? Where is the dialogue going? Where is the debate going? Where is even the common ideals of what is holding the country together? And so I'm starting to see this, and I'm obviously very afraid. I've warned about anti-Semitism more than a decade ago. What I saw on campuses, what I saw in the polarization in the political space. I truly, truly hope that the United States can look towards Europe. It took us far too long to wake up. The good thing I believe that exists in the United States that we don't have here in Europe is the flexibility of civil society, the agility of civil society, the ability of civil society to react quickly, to mobilize. There is a tendency here in Europe to always leave everything to the state. I think this is one of the big advantages that you have in the United States, of the ability of civil society to get to mobilize, in particular, of course, of the Jewish community, to mobilize, look for allies, and convince the rest of society that it's not only a danger to one community, but for the entire country, frankly, for the soul of the country.
Very well put. And before we wrap up, I'm sure there are JBS viewers who are stretching to see what shirt are you wearing. Can you help our viewers see it? We are life with a chai. What a beautiful way to reflect the Jewish spirit, Simone.
This is, I think, the lesson in particular we all should have taken and are all taking, should be taken since October 7th. So I'm wearing this all the day, all the time, every day. I have it in 10 different colors.
Simone, thank you so much. JBS viewers, I promised you a thought-provoking discussion with a chess player, and I think that's exactly what you got. Simone Rodan-Benzaquen. Follow her on X/Twitter. Read when she writes in the Free Press and elsewhere. Heed her words. There's a lesson here for all of us in the United States as well. This is David Harris defending Israel, and looking forward to seeing you again next week.